Edward Cole had devoted his life to raising his grandson, Jason, and taking care of his family. But in his old age, he was looked down upon and treated as a burden by his own son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren. The climax was when Jason pushed him into the lake in front of everyone, and the whole family just stood there laughing. Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. They say drowning is quiet, like slipping into sleep. Whoever said that never had their head forced under by the weight of betrayal. Don't be so dramatic. Grandpa, my grandson Jason, laughed as he shoved me off the dock into the lake. The water hit like a pane of glass, breaking over my chest. I flailed, the chill cutting through my ribs, and for a moment I thought the surgery scar near my shoulder might rip open from the sheer force of panic. I kicked upward, coughing Bubbles' lungs, screaming, heart pounding against my ribs like a fist begging for help. But there was no help. When my head broke the surface, I saw them all standing there, the people I had called family. My son Mark, arms crossed like he was watching some dull television rerun. My daughter-in-law Linda, wineglass in hand, smirking as if the whole thing were entertainment. And Jason, tall now at 17, towering above me with that grin people mistake for charm. Only I knew better. It wasn't charm. It was cruelty. Sharp and deliberate, disguised as confidence. Not one hand reached out. Not one voice shouted, "Stop." They stood there, waiting, almost curious, as if measuring whether I would sink or crawl back to the surface. I clawed toward the dock, my shirt heavy with water, my breath ragged. Jason bent forward, still laughing. "Guess you can swim after all." Tough old man. His friends clapped from the deck chairs, finding humor in the sight of me gasping for air. The laughter clung tighter than the water in my lungs. It echoed in my ears as I dragged myself up my knees, scraping raw against the planks. No one offered me a towel. No one asked if I was okay. I stood dripping in front of them, all silent, trembling from cold and rage, and walked past the grill still smoking with burgers, past the folding chairs, past every smiling face. Inside the house, the air felt cooler, mocking almost. I went to the small bathroom off the kitchen, shut the door, and stared into the mirror. What stared back didn't look like me. My gray hair plastered flat, my eyes bloodshot, my skin sagging and pale. I looked like a ghost haunting my own home. I pressed both palms to the sink, water still running down my sleeves, and whispered, "Is this who I am to them, a ghost they can laugh at?" Jason's laugh echoed in my head. It wasn't the laugh of a child anymore. It was the sound of a boy who had been taught that cruelty was clever, that disrespect was strength. And that was the moment something inside me hardened. They thought I would sink. They thought I would break. They forgot something about me, something I had forgotten myself until that night. I don't sink, I endure. That vow wrapped itself around my heart like armor. I didn't shout it. I didn't storm back outside demanding respect. I carried it silently, dripping onto the bathroom floor, my resolve forming stronger than the wood under my feet. By the time I walked back into the kitchen, they were already talking about something else. Cancun resorts, margaritas. My son sipping the lemonade I had made that morning. Linda scrolling for rental homes. Jason scrolling his phone as if I hadn't just been choking to death 10 minutes earlier. I sat quietly at the edge of the table, still damp, still trembling, invisible. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared. But I did. I stood left without a word and went down the hall to my bedroom. On the edge of the bed, the same bed where I once read Jason bedtime stories, I sat with a towel draped over my shoulders. The water might have left my skin, but not my heart. That stayed heavy. Heavy with years of dismissal jokes at my expense, birthdays forgotten, and endless requests for help with no thanks given. The push into the lake was new, yes, but the betrayal behind it was old. That night, I opened the drawer of my nightstand and pulled out my journal. Its pages had been blank for months, gathering dust. My hand trembled, but I pressed the pen to paper anyway. The first words came slow, jagged, but sharp. They will never get the chance to drown me again. I sat back, staring at the ink, feeling the promise settle inside me. That vow wasn't for them. It was for me. A reminder that silence wasn't weakness. It could be a warning. I closed the journal, set it on the table, and sat in the quiet hum of the lamp. My chest still ached from the water, but my resolve was stronger than the pain. That was the night I stopped being their ghost. That was the night I remembered I still held the pen. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the lake returned. The weight of water, the burn in my chest, the echo of Jason's laughter. But worse than his laughter was the silence of my own son. Mark had stood there, arms folded as if nothing had happened. He didn't flinch, didn't shout, didn't move. My only child, who should have stepped forward, had chosen to stand still. And Linda, his polished wife, had sipped her wine like cruelty was some sort of toast. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the shadows from the streetlight stretching long across the plaster. My shoulder ached where the cold had dug in. The doctor had warned me about that old injury, but it wasn't the pain that kept me awake. It was the truth of what I had seen in their eyes. Not fear, not concern. Amusement, indifference. I wasn't family to them anymore. I was entertainment, a liability, something to be tolerated until I was gone. I sat up, swung my legs off the bed, and reached for the journal again. My hand didn't shake this time. I wrote a single line beneath the vow. This silence is not weakness. It's a warning. When I put the pen down, I felt lighter. Not happy, not safe, but steady. That's what people forget about men my age. We don't need glory anymore. We need steadiness. And in that moment, steadiness became my weapon. The next morning, the house woke the way it always did. Jason stumbling in late, yawning eyes glued to his phone. Linda talking too loudly on speakerphone with one of her friends about vacation rentals. Mark sipping his coffee without looking at me. If they noticed I was quiet, they didn't show it. Maybe they thought silence meant surrender. They'd learn otherwise. Jason dropped into a chair across from me, scrolling. "Morning," I said evenly. He mumbled something that might have been, "yeah," without lifting his head. The boy I once knew, the boy who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms, whispering, "Don't let go, Grandpa," was gone. In his place sat a young man who couldn't bother to meet my eyes. I studied him, the slope of his shoulders, the smirk that curled when he found something funny on his phone, the way his foot tapped, like he was always restless, always looking for the next thrill. But I remembered another version of him barefoot, clutching wildflowers in his small fists, handing them to me as though they were treasure. I remembered him gasping through an asthma attack, me sitting by his bed through the night, whispering steady words while I held his tiny hand. I remembered buying him a second-hand guitar when he said he wanted to make music, his eyes shining like I'd handed him the moon. Those memories pressed down hard. Because that boy was gone. He'd been replaced by someone who could shove me into a lake and grin while I choked for air. And somewhere in the space between those two versions of him, something had broken. It hadn't been me who broke it. I knew that now. I had tried, God knows I had tried. I had given him my time, my savings, my love. But Mark and Linda, they taught him different lessons. That cruelty was clever. That entitlement was natural. That image mattered more than respect. I may have raised Jason day to day, but I hadn't raised the values that shaped him into who he'd become. His parents had seen to that. Later, when the kitchen quieted down, I found myself standing in the living room staring at that old guitar leaning against the corner. Dusty one string long since snapped, but still there. I reached out and brushed my fingers across its rough wood, and the memories came rushing back. 10 years old, Jason had sat cross-legged on the floor, strumming clumsy chords, grinning up at me like I'd given him everything he could ever want. "Grandpa, this is better than Christmas," he'd said. I'd laughed, told him to keep practicing, told him I was proud. Now that same boy had looked me in the eye while I drowned and laughed. I sat down with the guitar across my lap and strummed one of the few chords I remembered. The sound was hollow, flat, nothing like the bright tones Jason used to pull from it. The strings buzzed under my fingers, but I let the noise linger. Because beneath the sour notes was something truer, the sound of promises kept to someone who no longer remembered them. I thought of the years when Mark lost his job, when Linda complained about being stuck, when Jason was left at my house, just for a while. Weeks turned into months, months into years. I was the one signing his report cards, meeting with teachers, paying for braces. I was the one making lunches, buying cleats for soccer, sitting in folding chairs at games. They hadn't raised Jason. I had. And yet here we were. I leaned back on the couch, the guitar heavy on my lap, and felt the sharp sting of understanding. Jason wasn't just careless. He was cruel because he'd been allowed to be cruel. I had let small things slide. The rolled eyes, the dismissive tone, the jokes at my expense. I'd told myself it was just teenage mood swings. I told myself he'd grow out of it. I wanted peace more than I wanted respect, so I stayed silent. But silence, I finally realized, doesn't teach respect. It teaches permission. As the day dragged on, the house hummed with life, but none of it included me. Jason laughed with friends on the phone. Linda fussed about dinner parties. Mark disappeared into his work emails. I drifted from room to room, invisible in my own home, and the vow inside me grew sharper. I wasn't going to beg for attention anymore. I wasn't going to ask why they ignored me. I wasn't going to try to prove my worth to people who had already decided I was expendable. They thought I was weak because I was quiet. But they were wrong. My silence wasn't surrender anymore. My silence was the sharpening of a blade they didn't even see coming. That night, I sat at my desk under the soft hum of a lamp and opened the journal again. On the next page, beneath the vow, I wrote, "This silence is not absence. It's preparation." And for the first time in years, I felt steady enough to sleep. The morning after I wrote that line in my journal, I sat in the kitchen sipping coffee while the house moved around me. Jason breezed through like he always did, earbuds dangling, thumbs glued to his phone. Linda clicked across the tile in heels, too polished for a morning at home, already rehearsing lines for some story she'd tell her friends later. Mark muttered a morning dad without eye contact. His tie crooked his shoulders, slumped from a job that drained him. None of them noticed the notebook sitting right beside my cup. They never noticed the things that mattered most. My eyes drifted to the corner of the living room again, where that old guitar rested against the wall. Dusty ignored strings loose. Funny how one object can carry both joy and heartbreak in its wood. Every time I looked at it, I saw the boy Jason used to be, and the man he was becoming. I remember when he was 6. Mark had just lost his job, and Linda was restless, already complaining about money, about being stuck in a house she thought was too small for her ambitions. They dropped Jason off at my place just for a while. That while stretched into weeks, then months, then years. At first I told myself it was a blessing. I was retired. I had the time. I had the patience. I had love to give. Jason needed stability, and I could provide it. I fed him, clothed him, sat by his bed, when his asthma left him gasping. I carried him into the bathroom late at night, steam filling the room, as I sat him on my lap so he could breathe easier. I was the one who bought his school supplies when Mark and Linda forgot. I was the one who scraped together enough money for braces when the dentist said it wasn't optional, and I didn't mind. Not one bit. Because Jason back then was a boy who loved deeply. He'd run barefoot through my yard clutching wildflowers in his little fists, grinning like he'd found treasure. He'd crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, clutching his blanket tight, whispering, "Don't let go, Grandpa." And I never did. Not once. When he was 10, I found that second-hand guitar at a pawn shop downtown. It wasn't much to look at. One of the strings was already missing. But when I brought it home, his eyes lit up like I'd handed him the moon. He sat cross-legged on the floor, strumming clumsy chords, laughing at the sounds he made. "Grandpa," he said, "this is better than Christmas." That boy made me believe love could protect him from everything the world might throw his way. But somewhere between that barefoot child and the teenager who shoved me into the lake, something shifted. I can almost pinpoint when it began. The year he turned 16, Jason stopped looking me in the eye. He stopped saying thank you. He stopped joining me at the table for breakfast. The phone became his new companion, glowing late into the night, pulling him further and further from me. At first I blamed myself. Maybe I was too old-fashioned. Maybe I didn't understand the world he was growing up in. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't just teenage mood swings. It was the way Linda rolled her eyes when I told an old story, dismissing me like a child. The way Mark laughed along when Jason mocked me instead of correcting him. The way they started introducing me at church or to neighbors as Grandpa Ed. He gets confused sometimes. That little phrase, "gets confused," was like a knife slipped between the ribs. Each small jab chipped away at Jason's respect. And I let it happen. I smiled through it, told myself not to rock the boat, told myself he'd grow out of it. But respect doesn't grow in silence. It withers. I remember one night when Jason was maybe 11. We were sitting up late, him plucking at the guitar, me scribbling down simple chords on a scrap of paper. He looked up and said, "I'm going to be a musician one day, Grandpa. I'm going to make you proud." I told him I already was. But I wonder if he even remembers saying that. I wonder if he remembers the nights we stayed up past midnight, laughing when his fingers slipped off the strings, trying again and again until he got it right. I wonder if he remembers that I skipped a vacation I desperately needed just so I could buy him that guitar in the first place. Or maybe all of that got replaced by what Linda and Mark taught him. Instead, that image mattered more than kindness, that money was the only real security, that disrespect was just another form of confidence. I strummed the guitar that morning, the hollow sound echoing in the quiet room, and I realized something that made my hands shake, not from age, but from truth. Jason hadn't changed overnight. I had watched it happen inch by inch, year by year, and every time I stayed silent. Silence was easier than confrontation. But silence had delivered me here to the edge of a dock, shoved into a lake, laughed at by the boy I once carried on my shoulders. I set the guitar aside and walked to my desk. There, stacked in an old box, were Jason's school projects, construction paper essays, stick figure drawings, messy handwriting declaring big dreams. One in particular caught my eye. "When I grow up, I want to build machines that help people breathe better. I want to help people like my grandpa, who sometimes gets tired." I held that paper until my hands shook. The boy who wrote those words was gone. In his place stood a young man who laughed as I drowned. I slid the paper back into the box, carefully, almost reverently. That boy was gone, yes. But the man I still was, the man who had endured, was not. I sat down and opened my journal again. On the next line I wrote, "Silence delivered me here, but silence will deliver me out." And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the quiet. Later that week, I sat at the kitchen table while the house buzzed with its usual noise. Jason lounged on the couch, earbuds in, laughing at something on his phone. Linda clattered around the kitchen, her perfume too strong for a simple afternoon at home. Mark drifted in and out of the room, preoccupied, his mind tethered to spreadsheets and deadlines that seemed to matter more than the people in front of him. And me, I was invisible. It wasn't new. It had been building for years, the kind of erosion you don't notice until the ground crumbles under your feet. Birthdays forgotten. Holidays where my chair at the table was more obligation than invitation. Times when they asked for money without even a thank you. It was all small enough to ignore when taken piece by piece. But when Jason shoved me into that lake, it wasn't just an accident or a cruel joke. It was the final confirmation of what they really thought of me. Disposable. I watched Linda as she leaned against the counter, flipping through a glossy travel magazine. Cancun. This Hawaii, that her lips pursed in that perfect hostess smile she kept sharpened like a blade. Mark, I'm telling you, she said we need a break. We deserve a break. Mark muttered something about budgets, but his tone was flat resigned. Jason chimed in with a lazy, "Take me too," without lifting his eyes from the screen. They talked about vacations, while I sat 10 feet away, still sore from the lake water that had burned my lungs, still nursing knees scraped raw against the dock. Nobody asked how I was feeling. Nobody asked if I needed anything. I might as well have been part of the furniture. I stood and walked down the hall, my footsteps leaving no echo. In my room, I shut the door behind me and sat on the bed. For a long moment, I just stared at the dresser, the old lamp, the picture frame of Margaret on the nightstand. My late wife's smile still lit up that photograph, as if she'd been caught mid-laugh at one of my bad jokes. God, I missed that sound. She would have known what to say. She always did. Instead, I sat in silence. And in that silence, I felt the weight of every moment I'd swallowed down. The time Jason mocked me at a barbecue in front of his friends, calling me old man, and Mark had laughed along. The Thanksgiving when Linda introduced me to her co-workers as Grandpa Ed. He forgets things sometimes, and everyone chuckled politely. The countless times I cooked, cleaned, fixed broken steps, mowed the lawn, paid bills quietly, faithfully, only to be brushed aside like it was expected, not appreciated. The push into the lake was the first time they humiliated me out loud in the open. But the betrayal had been happening in small doses for years. A slow poison. I opened the drawer of my nightstand and pulled out the journal again. Its weight felt different now, heavier, as if the paper itself understood what it was carrying. I flipped past the vows I had written in the last few nights and set the pen to paper. They see me as an afterthought, a background character in their story. But I am not background. I am the foundation. I built this family and they forget it. I fed them, raised them, kept them afloat. And now they look at me like dead weight. The words bled onto the page with sharp strokes. I pressed harder than I meant to the pen, carving faint grooves into the paper underneath. I paused, looking around my room. On the shelves were photo albums I hadn't opened in years. Family vacations when Jason was little. Birthdays with candles glowing. A Christmas morning where he tore through wrapping paper, his small hands eager, his laughter pure. Evidence of a time when I wasn't invisible. When I wasn't mocked. When love still held weight. But photographs are liars, aren't they? They capture smiles, never silences. They hold the image of love, but not the erosion of it. They don't show the years when Mark's pride pushed him to keep me at arm's length, or when Linda's ambition twisted into contempt for anything that looked ordinary. They don't show Jason learning slowly that dismissing me was easier than respecting me. I closed the album and shoved it back onto the shelf. I didn't need proof of the past anymore. What I needed was control of the present. That evening I stepped back into the kitchen. The smell of garlic and butter filled the air. Linda was cooking pasta, her way of pretending everything was fine. Mark was at the table with his laptop open, sighing into his hands. Jason was sprawled across 2 chairs, tapping at his phone like the world lived inside that glowing screen. I sat down quietly, and for a moment I just watched them. Watched every dismissive glance, every careless word, every flick of a finger across a touch screen, and something inside me shifted from anger to clarity. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam my fist on the table. Instead, I opened my journal right there in front of them and wrote a single line. This silence is not surrender. It's strategy. Jason glanced up, smirked, and said, "Writing about how dramatic you were at the lake." Linda chuckled softly. Mark didn't even look. I didn't answer. I just kept writing. Because I knew something they didn't. They thought I was weak because I was quiet. They thought silence meant defeat. But silence in the right hands is a blade sharper than any insult. And that night, as I closed the journal and laid it on the table beside me, I realized I was done being their ghost. I was about to become their reckoning. That night, long after the dishes were washed, and the house had quieted into the rhythm of footsteps retreating down hallways, I sat alone at my desk. The lamp glowed softly, its light pooling over the open pages of my journal. I stared at the words I had written earlier. This silence is not surrender. It's strategy. The ink had dried, but the meaning was still fresh, sharp. I picked up the pen again, my hand steady now, and added the words that had been circling in my mind ever since Jason pushed me into that lake. They will never get the chance to drown me again. The scratch of the pen across paper sounded louder than anything in the house. It wasn't just a sentence, it was a vow carved into the page with the weight of years behind it. I leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking under me, and let the silence settle. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the quiet. My silence was no longer something they could dismiss. My silence had shape. My silence had teeth. When I finally closed the journal, I placed it on the desk, carefully, like a weapon loaded and ready. I sat there staring at the closed cover and felt something I hadn't felt in years, resolve that didn't depend on anyone else. The next morning, life in the house went on, as if nothing had changed. Jason stumbled in half awake, slouching toward the fridge. Linda fluttered around the kitchen in her silk robe, already making plans with a friend over the phone. Mark muttered a distracted morning before disappearing behind his laptop. To them, it was an ordinary day. To me, it was the first day of a new war. I poured myself coffee and sat at the table watching them, taking in every word, every dismissive glance, every smirk. They thought my silence meant I had given up. They didn't realize it meant I was paying attention more closely than ever. Jason sat across from me, scrolling his phone. I looked at him and saw not just the boy who had shoved me into the lake, but the boy I had raised, the boy who once pressed wildflowers into my hands, who used to crawl into my lap during storms. That boy had been swallowed up somewhere along the way. What was left was arrogance, cruelty, and the belief that he was untouchable. And maybe he was right up until now. I opened the journal again right there at the table and began to write. Jason glanced up, smirk tugging at his lips. "What are you doing, Grandpa, writing your memoir's gonna call it The Day I Almost Drowned?" Linda chuckled softly from the sink. Mark didn't even look up. I didn't answer. My pen kept moving. This silence is not weakness, it's warning. Jason rolled his eyes and went back to his phone. To him, my words were nothing. But I knew better. Words on paper carry weight. Words in ink can outlast laughter, outlast cruelty, outlast even blood ties. Later that evening, when the house was quiet again, I returned to my room and sat on the edge of the bed. I pulled open the nightstand drawer where old papers lay tucked away, birth certificates, insurance documents, deeds, and photographs. I hadn't looked at most of it in years. But now, as I sifted through the folders, I realized something control was still mine. Every account, every piece of property, every fund, it all still bore my signature. They might think they were already carving up my future, but the truth was simple. Nothing moved without me, and that was my leverage. I set the papers aside and picked up the guitar again, the one that had gathered dust in the corner. I strummed the strings, the hollow notes filling the room. The sound was brittle, out of tune, but it didn't matter. It reminded me of every sacrifice I'd made for Jason, every night I stayed up late, every dollar I scraped together to give him a chance at something better. I used to believe love was enough. I used to believe sacrifice guaranteed gratitude. I learned the hard way that love without boundaries becomes a leash for others to pull. I closed my eyes and let the sound fade. When I opened them, I wrote one last line in the journal before turning out the light. They think they've already buried me. They don't realize I'm still the one holding the pen. That night I slept better than I had in years. Not because the pain in my shoulder had eased, it hadn't. Not because the betrayal didn't still burn, it did. But because I had made a choice. The days of silence as surrender were over. The days of silence as strategy had begun. The following morning I lingered in the living room longer than usual. The house was quiet, sunlight spilling across the floorboards, catching dust motes that drifted like ghosts of time past. My eyes found the guitar again in the corner. It leaned there the way it always had, one string broken, the others loose and dull with disuse. The wood had faded, the varnish chipped. Yet, when I looked at it, I didn't see a broken instrument. I saw the boy I had once believed in, the boy I had poured my love and energy into. I picked it up and sat down on the couch. My fingers traced the body rough under my calloused hands. Slowly I strummed what chords I could remember. The sound was hollow flat, but it unlocked something deeper than music. Memories rushed back, clear and cruel. Jason, at 10 years old, cross-legged on the rug, cradling this very guitar as if it were treasure. His small hands fumbling over the frets, tongue poking from the corner of his mouth as he tried to press the strings just right. His laughter when the sound came out wrong. The way his face lit up when I showed him a simple chord. "I'm going to be a musician one day, Grandpa. I'm going to make you proud." I smiled, then told him I already was proud. I meant it. Every sacrifice I made felt worth it in that moment. I gave him my time, my patience, my love. I even gave him money I didn't have, skipping vacations, repairing old clothes, instead of buying new ones because I wanted him to believe in his dream. But dreams can twist when they aren't nurtured, right? Somewhere along the line, Jason's smile turned into a smirk. Gratitude turned into entitlement. Respect turned into cruelty. I set the guitar down, the sound of its last strum fading into silence. My hands shook, not from age, but from realization. Jason hadn't just changed, he had been shaped. Bit by bit, he had been molded by the dismissive smirks of his parents, by their quiet undermining of me, by their subtle lessons that kindness was weakness and mockery was clever. I could pinpoint moments, small at first. The way Jason rolled his eyes when I told a story. The way Mark laughed instead of correcting him. The way Linda said, "Oh, Dad gets confused sometimes," even though she knew I hadn't. Each jab chipped away at Jason's respect. And I let it happen. I wanted peace. I wanted to keep the family whole. I swallowed my pride, bit my tongue, and told myself it was just teenage mood swings. I told myself Jason would grow out of it. I told myself silence was the best way to keep harmony. But silence, I had finally learned, doesn't keep harmony. It keeps rot hidden until the whole beam collapses. I thought of Margaret, my late wife, and what she would say if she could see me now. She had been sharper than I was, quicker to see through people. She once told me, "Ed, love without boundaries isn't love. It's self-erasure." I never wanted to believe that. I wanted to think giving endlessly meant love would return endlessly. But Margaret had been right. Jason was proof. I stood and carried the guitar back to the corner, but I didn't lean it the same way. I set it upright, resting carefully as if it deserved to stand tall again, even if Jason didn't. Later that afternoon, I sat in my bedroom with a box of Jason's old school projects: crayon drawings, stick figures with lopsided smiles, essays about what he wanted to be. One caught my eye. His handwriting, clumsy letters uneven, but his words strong. When I grow up, I want to build machines that help people breathe better. I want to help people like my grandpa who sometimes gets tired. I read those words again and again until my hands trembled. That boy had once looked at me as someone worth protecting, worth honoring. Now the same boy had pushed me into a lake and laughed as I choked for air. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the box. I whispered, "That boy is gone." But as I closed the lid, I realized something else. The man I still was hadn't disappeared. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't powerless. My silence had become a weapon, and my pen had become a blade sharper than any cruelty they could throw my way. That night over dinner, Jason mocked me again. "So, Grandpa, you thinking of writing a book? The Old Man and the Lake?" His laugh rang sharp. Linda's smile polished as she sipped her wine. Mark chuckled once, then went back to eating. I didn't flinch. I didn't defend myself. I didn't even look up. Instead, I wrote in my journal later, "Every smirk is a stone in their own grave. Every laugh is a rope they tighten themselves." I wasn't going to shout. I wasn't going to demand respect. I was going to let them bury themselves in the silence they thought meant weakness. The guitar in the corner, the drawings in the box, the vows in my journal. These weren't reminders of loss anymore. They were reminders of clarity. Jason thought he'd shoved me into the lake and seen me sink. What he hadn't seen was that I'd come back up. Stronger, sharper, and ready. Silence had been my companion for years. At first it felt like wisdom, an old man choosing peace over pointless arguments. But sitting alone with my journal open, I began to see it for what it really was: surrender dressed up as patience. I could trace the path as clearly as if it were laid out on a map. The little moments when Jason tested boundaries, and I stayed quiet. The times he mocked me with that grin, and I forced a smile. The evenings Linda rolled her eyes at my stories, and I let the conversation drift away. The mornings when Mark dismissed my advice, and I swallowed the words I wanted to say. Each time I thought I was preserving peace. What I was really doing was teaching them that my dignity came cheap. I remembered the first time Jason called me old man in front of his friends. He must have been 12. The boys laughed, and I chuckled too, pretending it didn't sting. I thought if I laughed with them, it would take the edge off. Instead, it planted a seed. That seed grew into smirks, then into mockery, and finally into cruelty. I should have spoken then. I should have reminded him that respect wasn't optional. I should have reminded Mark, his father, that correcting a child is part of raising one. But I stayed quiet. Too afraid of causing tension, too afraid of being the problem. And silence became permission. The more I thought about it, the more I realized Jason hadn't changed overnight. I had watched it happen inch by inch, year by year. He didn't just become disrespectful, he was trained to be. Trained by neglect, by bad examples, by my unwillingness to draw a line in the sand. I walked into the living room that evening and found Jason sprawled on the couch, his shoes kicked off his feet up on the coffee table. He barely glanced at me when I entered. "Hey, old man," he said, his tone dripping with lazy amusement. I stood there for a moment looking at him. He didn't even notice the weight in my stare. To him, I was background noise, a fixture in the room, no more important than the lamp in the corner. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have words, but because I understood something new. Silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes silence is a mirror. I sat in my chair, opened my journal, and wrote while he scrolled on his phone. Every insult is a record. Every dismissal is proof. They believe silence means I have forgotten. But I am writing everything down. Later that night, as I was putting the journal away, I thought about all the sacrifices I'd made for this family. The bills I paid, the braces, the guitar, the meals, the long nights by Jason's bedside during asthma attacks. None of it had bought respect. None of it had bought love. Because respect isn't purchased, it's demanded. I realized my silence had done more damage than their words ever could. I had erased myself piece by piece, believing it was the price of keeping the family together. But a family built on contempt isn't together. It's just pretending. The next morning, I tried something new. I sat at the breakfast table, coffee steaming in front of me. When Jason mumbled a half-hearted morning without looking up, I didn't respond. When Linda made a pointed remark about me leaving crumbs on the counter, I didn't apologize. When Mark asked if I could help him with an errand, I looked him in the eye and said, "Not today." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Mark blinked, confused, then shrugged it off. He wasn't used to me drawing lines. He was used to me saying yes, used to me smoothing things over. Linda pursed her lips but said nothing, and Jason just snorted and went back to his phone. I sipped my coffee calm, steady. I didn't need to shout to be heard. I didn't need to argue to prove a point. My silence had become something different now, not the silence of surrender, but the silence of refusal. That day, I wrote in my journal, I am no longer disappearing. I am sharpening. The words steadied me more than anything had in years. Later, I found myself standing in front of the window, staring out at the lake. Its surface was calm now, rippling gently in the wind, as if mocking me with its serenity. That same lake had nearly swallowed me whole, had almost become my grave. But it hadn't. I had come back up, and in that moment I understood something Margaret used to say. You don't drown when you fall into water. You drown when you stop fighting to breathe. I hadn't stopped. Jason thought pushing me into that lake proved my weakness. But what it really did was remind me of my strength. It woke something inside me that I had buried under years of silence. That evening when Linda started talking about planning another dinner party, I sat at the table, hands folded, and just watched. Watched how Mark nodded along without listening. Watched how Jason sprawled carelessly, interrupting her with jokes. Watched how Linda's voice grew sharper when she thought no one was paying attention. I wasn't angry anymore, not exactly. What I felt was colder, quieter. A kind of resolve I hadn't known I was capable of. I picked up my journal, opened to a blank page, and wrote, "Silence is no longer their advantage. It is mine." I closed the book, set it beside me, and looked around the room. None of them noticed, none of them cared, and that was fine, because soon enough they would. It was late when I overheard him. The house had gone still except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. I was sitting at my desk, the lamp glowing low, my journal open in front of me. I had been writing for an hour, letting the words steady me. Every entry was a stone in the foundation of something I couldn't quite name yet, but I knew it was stronger than the silence that had weighed on me for years. Then I heard it. Jason's voice. It drifted through the thin wall from the living room, muffled but clear enough. His tone was low, conspiratorial, the voice of someone savoring a secret. "College funds basically mine," he was saying. I froze. My pen stopped mid-stroke. My stomach tightened as I leaned forward, listening. Once the old man's gone, Jason continued, his voice carrying the arrogance of youth. Dad says it's set. That's like, what, 50 grand easy. I'll transfer once he's out of the picture. The words landed like stones in my chest. Out of the picture. That's all I was to him. Not a grandfather, not the man who had raised him, not the man who had sat by his bed through asthma attacks, who had bought him braces, who had given up vacations to make sure he had what he needed. To him, I was just a picture, something to be removed. I sat back in my chair, hands trembling. Not from age, not from weakness, but from shock. I had spent years blaming myself for Jason's change, convincing myself I'd done something wrong. Too strict, too soft, too patient, too old-fashioned. I had worn every possible failure like a coat, telling myself if I had been better, Jason wouldn't have turned cruel. But in that moment, I understood. Jason hadn't simply slipped away. He had been pulled, shaped, taught, by a father who never learned accountability, by a mother who measured value in image and money, by the entitlement of a world that rewarded cruelty disguised as confidence, and now by greed. I opened my journal again and scribbled furiously beneath the vow I had written the night before. They think I am a fund to be transferred. They forget I am still the one holding the pen. I underlined pen twice, pressing so hard the ink bled through the page. That small instrument ink on paper suddenly felt heavier than any weapon I had ever carried. In ink, I could shift the ground beneath their feet without raising my voice. In ink, I could take away the power they thought they already owned. I closed the journal and sat in the dim glow of the lamp, the house quiet again, except for Jason's occasional laugh from the other room. Every chuckle felt like a nail driven deeper into the coffin of what we used to be. The next morning, I walked into the kitchen with steady steps. Jason was slouched at the table, shoveling scrambled eggs onto his plate without so much as a glance at me. "Morning," I said. "Yeah," he mumbled, scrolling on his phone. I studied him as he ate, his posture careless, his world reduced to the screen glowing in his hand. He was already moving on from last night's cruelty, as if it had never been spoken aloud. To him, betrayal wasn't betrayal. It was just strategy. A step on the ladder he thought he was climbing. Mark came in a few minutes later, adjusting his tie, sipping the coffee I had brewed. "Dad," he started. "Could you—" "Not today," I said quietly, cutting him off with a look. He blinked, caught off guard. He wasn't used to me refusing. He wasn't used to me drawing lines. He was used to the man who said yes, the man who stayed silent. Linda appeared next, her robe perfectly cinched her hair, already styled as if the world were watching her even in the morning light. "We've got dinner tonight," she said to no one in particular. "Frank and Sheila are coming. Please try to look presentable, Dad." Her voice was sugar, but her meaning was acid. I didn't answer. Instead, I poured myself coffee, sat down at the table, and watched them. Watched every dismissive word, every sidelong glance, every smirk. I wasn't angry anymore. Not exactly. What I felt was colder, quieter. Resolve. Later that day, I climbed the stairs to the attic. Dust clung to the air, the scent of cedar heavy around me. Boxes were stacked neatly, each one holding fragments of a life spent building something for others. At the bottom of a tin container, I found the trust documents I had signed years ago, the education fund for Jason. I sat cross-legged on the floor, the paper crackling in my hands. I read it slowly, word by word, like I used to read bedtime stories aloud. Only this time there was no magic, just clarity. The fund was still in my name. The control was still mine. Jason's confidence wasn't built on fact. It was built on assumption, on entitlement, on the arrogance of a boy who had been told the world belonged to him without ever being asked to earn it. That was his weakness. I folded the papers carefully and placed them back in the tin. Jason thought I was out of the picture. He thought I was a ghost already fading. He didn't realize the ghost still held the keys. That night, after the house quieted again, I sat at my desk and opened the journal. They think my silence means absence. They think my absence means defeat. They forget I am still here, and I am watching. I closed the journal, placed it on the desk beside me, and stared out the window at the lake. Its surface shimmered in the moonlight, calm, deceptive. The same water that had nearly taken me was now my witness. Jason thought he'd seen me sink. What he hadn't realized was that he had only pushed me deeper into resolve. They were waiting for me to disappear. But what they didn't know was that I had just begun to appear. I went back to the attic the next morning with a pad of paper, a pencil, and the steadiness of a man who has finally remembered where he keeps his tools. The air up there smelled like cedar and old summers. Light cut through the slats and made pale ladders on the floorboards. I knelt by the metal tin again and laid everything out like parts on a workbench: deed statements, beneficiary forms, a brittle copy of our marriage certificate, and the trust papers I'd signed the year Jason turned 10. I didn't rush. I read every page, lips moving a little the way you do when you mean to get it right. Dates, account numbers, custodian notes, signatures. Mine. Always mine. The education fund untouched, intact in my name. I underlined that line on my notepad and wrote it again below larger, the way I used to rewrite a dimension when a junior engineer miscopied a measurement control mine. There were other relics, an old healthcare directive with blanks that needed witnesses, a generic power of attorney kit I'd never filled in because back then I didn't think I'd need it. I pressed my thumb to the spot where a signature would go and imagined handing that kind of power to the same people who watched me drown. The thought stiffened my spine. Not yet. Not them. Maybe not ever. I made an inventory columns and tidy checkboxes the way men like me make sense of what hurts. Accounts, bank bonds, the education fund. Property, the house, the lake lot. Documents to update POA, will health directive. Actions, none yet. Watch. Record. Verify. I wasn't going to flail. I wasn't going to call a family meeting and demand decency from people who used up decency like paper napkins. I was going to let them keep believing the ground was fixed while I mapped where it could move. I slid each document into a fresh sleeve and labeled it in block letters. Then I put the stack back in the tin and set the tin on a higher shelf, still mine. Still here, just a little farther from hands that didn't know the weight of what they touched. On the way down the steps, the old wood groaned under my feet. The sound had always comforted me. Houses that groan are houses that tell the truth. At the bottom, I paused long enough to breathe the cooler air of the hallway, then went to the kitchen and poured coffee. I didn't hide the pencil tucked behind my ear. I wanted to look like a man doing small chores, not a general drawing a map. Jason wandered in, hair wild, phone glowing. "Morning," he mumbled already, halfway through a laugh that wasn't mine. I nodded and kept my eyes on the steam rising from my mug. He didn't notice the notepad folded in my pocket. He didn't notice anything that didn't reflect him back to himself. Linda came next. Crisp robe, crisp tone. "We're doing a little get-together Friday," she announced, riffling the mail, as if authority were a texture she could sort with her fingers. "Frank and Sheila, maybe the neighbors. Keep the grill clean, please." She glanced at me, then passed me the way you glance at a clock you don't intend to set. "Friday," I said. I let the word sit without promise. Mark arrived last, tie-skewed hunger in his eyes that no paycheck ever fixed. Dad later, I might need. He stopped himself when he saw my look. Not angry, not pleading. Balanced. "Later," I said. "Maybe." He blinked. then nodded like a man who found a door where a wall used to be. I spent the afternoon doing what I've always done, useful things nobody thanks you for. I tightened the loose hinge on the pantry door so it wouldn't bang when someone slammed it getting chips. I trimmed the wobbly felt pads under the dining chairs so they'd slide without scraping. I oiled the lock on the back door so it would close with a quiet click you could trust. Small work steadies the mind. It also leaves a record no one sees until something breaks, and they can't remember when it last worked right. Every so often I wrote in the notebook. Not my journal, the lined pad I kept in my shirt pocket, where a cigarette pack would have gone in a younger man's life. 12:10 p.m. Jason on speakerphone laughing about someone's idiot coach. 1:35 p.m. Linda calls Pilates friend, uses the word placement the way people try on shoes in a store mirror. 2:50 p.m. Mark asks about timelines and liquidity to someone who doesn't love him back. This was not paranoia. This was measurement. When you stop arguing with a storm, you learn how to read wind. By late day, I stood at the window over the sink and watched the lake. Its skin was dimpled by a breeze. Somewhere under that surface were the bubbles I'd coughed out 2 nights earlier. I pictured them rising, popping, gone. Not me. Not this time. I wasn't going to vanish into a story other people told about the old man who faded. I was going to become the paragraph they couldn't edit. I decided 3 things and wrote them down, printing each one on its own line. 1. I will not correct their assumptions. 2. I will not volunteer access. 3. I will act only on paper and at my pace. Not petty, not cruel, just boundaries made legible. That evening I put the tin back in the attic and brought down only a manila folder with copies, account overviews. The trust summary dates circled in red. I didn't hide the folder. I left it on my desk, closed like a book nobody in this house would ever think to read. If someone snooped, they'd see copies and feel smart. If no one did, I'd be reminded how little they see. At dinner, I took my seat and kept my hands folded. Jason did his usual theater feat on the spare chair jokes at someone else's expense, the easy drawl of a boy who's never been told enough. Linda floated conversation topics like centerpieces, arranging them for her own applause. Mark picked at his food and his phone in equal measure. The 3 of them looked like a family if you didn't listen. Friday, Linda said again, more to herself than to anyone. Let's do something casual but tasteful. She meant expensive that pretends not to care. And please, she flicked her eyes my way, let's keep things smooth. Smooth to Linda meant me quiet, and everyone else entertained. Once I would have obliged. Tonight I chewed, swallowed, and said nothing. Smooth can be the slick of oil before a match. After dishes, I took my walk down to the public path by the lakeshore. I nodded at Mrs. Carter, 2 houses over. She gave me the kind of look people give a man who reminds them of their better uncle's concern without trespass. Evening, she said. Evening, I returned. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need witnesses yet. I needed truth I could stand on alone. Back home, I sat at my desk with the manila folder and copied my attic inventory into the journal in clean lines. At the bottom, I added a sentence that felt like a blueprint. I will let them reveal themselves in their own light. People will do the work for you if you stop carrying the lamp. I thought about calling Frank. I could see his face in my head, those thick glasses, that rough affection that always lands like a steadying hand on your shoulder. Not yet, I decided. Not because pride kept me from help, but because timing is part of strategy. There is the moment you confide, and there is the moment you can prove. I wanted both. When the house quieted, I staged nothing, but I did not hide clarity. I left my pillbox lined up and filled for the week, lid snapped shut so clean you could hear the competence. I set my keys in a neat row house garage shed metal as tidy as my breath. I placed a single sticky note on my desk that said, "Say T-oil mower" in block letters. The right people know these are not props. They are the grammar of a life in order. Before bed, I stood at the kitchen sink in the dark and listened to the house settle. The refrigerator buzzed. A branch tapped the eaves. Somewhere water plinked in an old pipe the way it has since Reagan. This is what a man misses when he's busy asking to be seen the quiet proof that he already exists. Friday would come. People would laugh too loud. Someone would use a word like liability thinking it sounded responsible. I wouldn't correct them. I would mark the date, the hour, the witnesses, the phrasing. And then when the time was right, I would act in ink. On my way to bed, I wrote one more line and let it be the last thing my eyes saw before the lamp went dark. Let them think I'm air. Paper holds a shape air cannot. Friday arrived with the smell of charcoal and the low clatter of glasses being arranged on the counter. Linda had been in hostess mode since dawn, fluttering from room to room, with her clipboard smile, the one that said she was staging a magazine spread, rather than preparing to welcome friends. Mark trailed behind her most of the day, dutiful but distant, doing the heavy lifting without really listening. Jason, of course, contributed nothing. He lounged in the backyard, tossing a football lazily with a buddy who had come early, acting as though the entire house was his stage. By evening, the guests arrived. Neighbors, colleagues, a couple whose names I never bothered to memorize. The backyard filled with chatter, the clink of ice in glasses, the glow of string lights. Linda insisted Mark hang just right. It was the kind of gathering where appearances mattered more than truth, where people wore their best shoes to stand on someone else's lawn and rehearse stories about vacations and promotions. I took my seat at the far end of the patio table, close enough to hear, far enough to be ignored. It was a position I had come to know well visible, but invisible. A body that filled a chair without filling a conversation. Linda fluttered around the grill like she'd cooked 1,000 meals in her life. Mark flipped burgers with the stiff precision of a man carrying out orders, rather than enjoying his own backyard. Jason and his friend laughed too loudly at a story I couldn't hear their voices, slicing through the hum of the evening like knives. And the guests, well, they laughed at whatever they were supposed to laugh at. That's how these gatherings work. Then it happened. I don't remember who said it first, one of Linda's friends, maybe Sheila. She leaned in wine glass, tilted, and asked Jason about college. Jason grinned, leaning back in his chair like a king. "Oh, I'm not worried," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Grandpa's got it covered. Old man's basically a walking scholarship fund." The table erupted in laughter. Laughter. As though my life, my savings, my sacrifices were just another punchline. I sat there, the burger on my plate, cooling the condensation sliding down my glass, and I felt the heat crawl up my neck. Mark chuckled. Linda sipped her drink with that polished half-smile, and Jason basked in the attention like he'd delivered a masterful joke. Not one of them corrected him. Not one of them said, "Show some respect." The words didn't wound me the way they might have once. No, they clarified me. Every chuckle was a signature on a contract I hadn't written, but was now willing to enforce. Every smirk was a nail in the coffin of the man they thought I was silent, forgetful, powerless. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't push back from the table in anger. I picked up my fork, cut a piece of the burger, and ate it slowly. Then I reached for my journal, which I had carried with me in my jacket pocket, and I opened it right there at the table. I wrote in neat, deliberate strokes. They laugh at the foundation that holds them up. Foundations can shift. When I closed the journal, Jason snorted. "What's that, Grandpa, your diary gonna write about how we're all ungrateful again?" His friend laughed with him, nudging his shoulder. Linda smiled at the guests. "He likes to write," she said lightly, dismissing me with the flick of a sentence. It keeps him busy. The conversation moved on chatter about stock tips and vacation plans, as though nothing had been said. But I sat there steady, holding the weight of what I had just recorded. Later, when the guests left and the house grew quiet again, I carried the journal back to my room. I sat at my desk, the lamp humming softly, and read the line I had written at the table. I copied it onto a new page, then added, "Their laughter is proof. Proof is stronger than protest." The words steadied me. I thought about Margaret again, her voice sharp and kind all at once. She would have told me to stop waiting for them to change. She would have told me to stop giving away dignity in the name of peace. She would have told me that love without respect is not love. It's servitude. I closed my eyes and whispered into the quiet, "You were right, love. You were right." When I opened them, I slid the journal back into the drawer, laid my pen neatly beside it, and exhaled a long, steady breath. That dinner party wasn't humiliation. It was revelation. And revelation once seen cannot be unseen. The knock came on a Sunday afternoon, sharp and familiar. I shuffled to the door, half expecting another delivery Linda had ordered without ever asking me. But when I opened it, there stood Frank Donovan, broad shoulders, graying hair, the same thick glasses that had slid down his nose since we were young men in uniform. "Ed," he said, voice rough but warm. "You look like hell." I laughed, once a short bark. "Good to see you too, Frank." He stepped inside without waiting, carrying with him the smell of tobacco and leather, the kind of scent that clings to men who've lived outdoors more than in. He set a brown paper bag on the counter, pastrami sandwiches from the deli we used to haunt. He always brought food, as if friendship needed meat and mustard to be real. We sat at the kitchen table. Jason was upstairs, Linda out with friends, Mark hidden behind a laptop. For once, the house felt like mine again. Frank studied me for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. "What happened to you, brother? You look smaller." I leaned back the chair, creaking. They tried to drown me. He blinked, then leaned forward. I told him everything. The shove into the lake, the laughter, the silence, the dinner party where my savings became a punchline. I spoke quietly, evenly, but my hands clenched on the table as I recounted each detail. Frank didn't interrupt. He just listened, jaw-tightening, eyes burning the way they always did when someone crossed a line. When I finished, he sat back hard, exhaling through his nose. "Damn, Ed. You raised that boy. You carried that family. And they treat you like a burden, like a joke." He shook his head. "No, that doesn't stand. Not with me. And it sure as hell shouldn't stand with you." I rubbed my forehead. "What do you want me to do? Frank yell at them, kick them out. You know how that'll look. I'll be the crazy old man shouting at his family." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Then don't shout. Get smart. Paper beats noise every time." From his jacket pocket, he pulled a small white card and slid it across the table. I stared at the embossed letters, "Thomas Green, Attorney at Law, Estate Planning, Elder Rights Trusts." Frank tapped the card. "This guy helped my sister when her kids started sniffing around her accounts like vultures. Smart as a whip, doesn't scare easy. You need someone in your corner who understands leverage, not feelings, not arguments. Paper." I turned the card over in my hands. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have. He was right. Arguments fade, but documents hold. Ink outlasts cruelty. "You think it's time I asked quietly?" Frank looked at me hard. "Ed, it's past time. You survived the lake. You survived years of their little digs and jabs. But surviving isn't the same as living. You want to keep living, you need to take back control." His words sank deep. They weren't harsh. They were true. We ate the sandwiches in silence, after that mustard dripping onto the paper wrappers, the taste reminding me of younger days, when the world felt wide and open. For a moment, I almost forgot the weight of the house around me. When Frank left, he clasped my shoulder and squeezed. "Call him Ed. Don't wait. You deserve better than this." After the door shut, I sat at the table with the card in front of me. I traced the letters with my finger, then opened my journal. On a fresh page, I wrote, "A friend brings bread when you're hungry, and a weapon when you're cornered." Today, Frank brought both. I closed the book, slipped the card into my pocket, and felt something stir in me that I hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly. Not yet, but purpose. The card burned a hole in my pocket for 2 days. I carried it around like a secret I wasn't ready to say out loud. At breakfast, I'd thumb the edges of it while Jason laughed at something on his phone. At night, I'd place it on the nightstand beside the lamp and stare at the bold letters until sleep dragged me under. Thomas Green, attorney, at law. On the third morning, I made the call. The house was quiet. Mark at work, Linda running errands, Jason asleep upstairs. I sat at the kitchen table, the phone heavy in my hand, and dialed the number. Green and Associates. "How may I direct your call?" A woman's voice answered, crisp and professional. "Thomas Green," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "One moment, please." I tapped my finger on the table, while soft hold music filled my ear. When his voice came on, it was lower, slower, the kind of voice that doesn't rush because it doesn't need to. "This is Thomas Green." "Mr. Green," I said, clearing my throat. "My name's Edward Cole. A friend of mine, Frank Donovan, gave me your card. He said you might be able to help a man steady the ground under his feet." There was a pause on the other end, then the faint sound of a chair creaking. "Mr. Cole." "That's what I do. Why don't you tell me a little about what's happening?" So I did. Not all at once, but in pieces. The shove into the lake, the dinner party where my savings became a joke, the whispers I'd overheard about college funds inheritance placement. I didn't embellish, didn't beg. I spoke plainly the way I'd write an inventory, one insult stacked on another one, cruelty laid bare. When I finished, he asked just one question. "Do you still control the accounts and property?" "Yes," I said. "Every account, every deed, every signature still mine." Another pause. "Then you hold the power. They may not realize it, but you do. The key is making sure that power stays in your hands legally and visibly. Paperwork, Mr. Cole? That's where we start." I felt something inside me loosen like a knot pulled free. Paperwork. Not arguments, not shouting matches around the dinner table, but documents with signatures that couldn't be laughed off. "I want to meet," I said. "Tomorrow afternoon," he replied without hesitation. 3 o'clock? My office on Main Street. Bring any documents you have, trusts, wills, account statements. We'll go from there." After I hung up, I sat there staring at the phone. My hand was trembling, but not from weakness, from adrenaline, from the sharp clarity of a man who has finally picked up a weapon he'd forgotten he owned. When Jason came downstairs an hour later, yawning and asking what was for lunch, I just looked at him. For the first time, I didn't feel the burn of humiliation. I felt something colder, steadier. He thought he knew the future. He thought my silence was permission. But tomorrow, I would start building walls he couldn't see. That night, I opened the tin from the attic again. I spread the documents out on the bed in neat rows, deeds, account, summaries, trust papers, old wills. Margaret's handwriting on the margins of one, my own careful signature on another. Pieces of a life lived steadily now repurposed as armor. I made copies of each, sliding them into a folder, labeling every section with block letters. Property, accounts, health, trust. My penmanship was slower these days, but still sharp enough to command respect. Before bed, I sat at my desk with my journal and wrote, "A phone call is just air until it's recorded on paper." Today I turned air into ink. Tomorrow I will turn ink into stone. I closed the journal, slid it into the drawer, and placed the folder of documents on the chair beside my bed. When I turned out the light, I felt the darkness differently. It wasn't heavy anymore, it was cover. They thought they had already written me out of the picture. Tomorrow I would remind them who still held the pen. Thomas Green's office sat over a bakery on Main Street, the kind of place where you smell butter and paper at the same time. Sun came through tall windows and pooled on a row of framed degrees. The carpet didn't squeak when you walked on it. The waiting room had 2 chairs, not 6, no pretense of being busy for the sake of it. Mr. Cole, the receptionist, said silver hair, steady eyes name tag that read Marion. She offered water the way nurses do as a kindness, not a sales pitch. "He'll see you now." Thomas stood when I entered. No oversized desk between us, just a table with 2 chairs and a legal pad. His handshake was dry and direct. "Ed," he said, as if we'd met a long time ago and simply picked up the thread. "Let's make today useful." He didn't ask for a speech. He asked for facts. I laid the folder on the table and slid out copies, deeds account, summaries, the old will, the education fund, overview, all labeled in my block letters. He listened while I sketched the last month in plain strokes, the doc. The laughter, the jokes about my money at dinner, the late-night whisper about being out of the picture. He didn't wince. He didn't frown for me. He drew a small box on his pad and wrote 2 words above it, money and boundaries. "These are different problems," he said, tapping each word with his pen, "but the solutions look alike on paper." I let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding. Paper, then. Paper, he agreed. First, locks you control. Second, rules with teeth. He turned the pad so I could see and started a checklist. Audit every account. Verify sole control. Add friction, no online transactions without physical token. Cooling off window before any transfer. Alerts on inquiries. Duplicate notices to my office. Credit file frozen at all bureaus. Safe deposit box for originals at a credit union key in your pocket, not a drawer. New mailing address for financial correspondence, P.O. Box. Primary phone on file changed to a number only you and I hold. He glanced up. All lawful, all quiet, no confrontation required. "Good," I said. "I'm done with arguments that end in laughter. Then we'll let paper do the talking." He flipped to a fresh page. Now boundaries. He wrote as he spoke, neat and unhurried. Updated durable power of attorney, someone you trust, not someone who wants convenience. Medical directive, clear witnessed. Revised will with a no contest clause. Letter of intent in your voice, but filed here to be read aloud if you ask or if circumstances demand. Frank Donovan, I said when he asked whom I trusted. If he can't, then Marion out there. She looks like someone who remembers the details. Marion's mouth twitched when I said it later at the counter. She took the compliment like a person who prefers competence to flattery. Thomas nodded. All right. And the education fund? I looked at the summary, my own signature at the bottom, the balance steady where I'd left it years ago. They think it's already theirs, I said. They talk about it like it's in transit. Close it, redirect it, freeze it, or observe. He said, giving me the 4 doors, and no pressure to choose the flashiest. What do you want? I want to see what people do when they think time is on their side, I answered. But I want the door shut to anyone but me. Then we keep it as is and ring it with locks, he said already, noting the custodian's requirements and ordering a physical token. No token, no movement. We went line by line. He asked if anyone had contacted a bank or custodian recently, just to understand the process. I told him what I'd overheard and what I suspected. He didn't scold me for waiting this long. He simply wrote intent, recorded, and underlined the date. Last piece for today, he said, "Not mandatory, but smart if you anticipate whispers." What kind of whispers? The kind that turn competence into a rumor, he said. A brief capacity evaluation by a neutral clinician. It goes in the file. If anyone floats the word confused to leverage a court, I fax a sentence Mr. Cole demonstrates decisional capacity, not ammunition. A seatbelt. I almost laughed short and surprised like a hiccup. "I was an engineer," I said. "I like seatbelts. Then we'll buckle up," he said. Marion reappeared with a small stack of forms and a glass of water. She copied my ID, read names back to me slowly as she typed, "Franklin Donovan, primary medical agent." She didn't ask why not my son. She didn't need to. Thomas slid a draft of the will across to me. "This clause," he said, "tapping it means if anyone contests and loses, they lose what they would have received. It doesn't stop anger. It stops collection on anger. And the house I asked. The lake lived in that question. The window over the sink, the path to the dock, the groan of the attic stairs, my whole life stitched into boards. You're attached," he said, "not as a warning, as a truth. You have options that keep attachment honest. You can reserve a life estate for yourself and deed the remainder to a cause you choose, or we can hold an executed deed in my vault with instructions you can revoke. No rush. Choose with a clear head." "Hold it," I said. "I decide when the room is quiet." "Good," he said. He took out one more sheet, a letterhead, with his name at the top, blank below. "This will be your letter," he said. "We build it from your words, then I read it in a neutral room if you ever ask me to. Not dramatic. Just record and finality." He handed me a pen. "Write the first line. We'll fill in the bones later." I thought of the doc, the laughter, the way Linda says responsible when she means convenient. I wrote carefully. To those who mistook my quiet for consent, I gave once. I won't give twice. Thomas read it and nodded. "That will do." We spent another hour doing the kind of work that never trends but always matters. He dictated. Marion returned and disappeared. Forms accumulated with yellow flags telling me where to initial. We froze my credit. We opened a P.O. box. He had the form ready. He gave me a list of banks that still require in-person tokens and circled the one that held Jason's fund. He set alerts, so any inquiry would ping his office and mine. He called the credit union and reserved a safe deposit appointment for tomorrow. Invisible lawful bricks, one after another. Somewhere in there he paused and said, "One more question. Ed, are you looking for revenge or release?" "Release," I said before I could dress the answer up. The word landed like a tool in a palm, a fit you know by feel. "Then we are on the right map," he said. We stood. He shook my hand again, the same plain confidence. "When you leave here, you'll have 3 things. A to-do list, a record, and a room you can invite people into or not." What about telling them I asked, meaning Mark, meaning Linda, meaning the boy who performs cruelty for applause? "You'll know when to speak," he said. "Until then, let your documents be your voice." Marion walked me out. At the front desk, she slid me a small card with 3 dates, the safe deposit appointment, the P.O. box pickup, and the clinician's slot for the capacity note. "Side entrance on Friday," she said softly. "Less fuss." "Thank you," I said, and meant the you as much as the logistics. Downstairs, the bakery door opened, and a warm gust of sugar and yeast followed a little boy into the street. His mother laughed when he pointed at the window cakes. I stood there a second longer than the light required, and realized my hands had stopped trembling. Not because I was suddenly strong, but because the strength I still had finally had somewhere to stand. I drove home by the lake road. The water wore the afternoon like polished steel. At a red light, I took out my notebook and printed in neat lines. Credit frozen. Tokens ordered. P.O. Box set. Safe deposit tomorrow. Capacity letter Friday. Will and directives drafted. Underneath, I wrote, "Noise is wind. Ink is weight." At the house, Jason looked up from the couch when I came in, mostly to be seen not looking. "How was your little errand?" he asked. The word little did all the heavy lifting. "Productive," I said, and set the mail on the counter without another syllable. Linda's eyes flicked to the folder in my hand, then slid off it like water off wax. Mark hovered in the doorway, as if a different angle might show him what had changed. I made tea poured only for myself, and carried the cup to my room. At my desk, I opened the journal and wrote one clean line in the middle of the page so it could breathe. Today, I traded explanations for evidence. I capped the pen, lined up the keys, and listened to the house settle into its evening script. Release doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like locks clicking in the right doors. I didn't sleep much that night. Not from fear. Fear had given way to something quieter, steadier. My mind kept running through the pages Thomas had set before me, every signature, every clause. The weight of it all wasn't heavy. It was anchoring. The education fund sat at the center of my thoughts. Jason's prize, his assumed inheritance, his walking scholarship fund as he called me at the dinner table. Thomas had asked what I wanted to do, close it, redirect it, or leave it as bait. I had chosen the last. Not out of malice, but out of clarity. If Jason wanted to show me who he was, I would let him. The next morning I went to the credit union. The clerk wore a name tag that read, "Stephanie," and smiled the way you smile at a man you assume will take forever at the counter. I slid my ID across, recited the account numbers, and waited. She tapped keys, her expression flattening as the system pulled up balances that hadn't been touched in years. "Would you like to make changes to the beneficiary information?" she asked politely. "No," I said steady. "But I'd like to add security protocols." She looked surprised, as if most old men didn't know those words. I leaned on the counter, voice calm, and spelled it out. Two-step authentication physical token required duplicate notices to my P.O. box. I didn't blink when she asked questions. I didn't fumble when she printed forms. I initialed every page in sharp block letters, the pen biting into the paper. When it was done, she handed me the token, a small black device with a digital screen. "Without this," she said, "nothing moves." I closed my fist around it. Nothing moves. That night at dinner, Jason leaned back in his chair, smirking. "So, Grandpa, when's my tuition fairy showing up?" Mark chuckled softly, shaking his head, but not correcting him. Linda smiled into her wine. I cut my steak, slowly chewed, swallowed, and set my fork down. I looked Jason dead in the eye. "You'll get exactly what you've earned." The room went still for a moment. Jason's smirk faltered, then returned, though thinner this time. "Guess that means everything," he said, forcing a laugh. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My silence pressed heavier than any argument. Later in my room, I opened the journal. I wrote locks in place, token in hand. Let them think the door is wide open. Their entitlement will write the story for me. The next week, the whispers began. I heard Jason on the phone again late one night, his voice sharp with frustration. "They say it's locked down now." I don't know what happened. Dad said it was supposed to be easy. He cursed under his breath. "Don't worry. He won't last forever. It's just a matter of time." I sat at my desk, pen poised, recording every word. Each sentence was a stone stacked into a wall between us. When I looked at my notes, I realized something. I wasn't just defending myself. I was teaching them, whether they knew it or not, that silence is not absence. It's preparation. Jason thought he was clever. Mark thought he was practical. Linda thought she was polished. I knew the truth. I was still the one holding the pen. In the days that followed, I carried myself differently. Not louder, not with some dramatic flourish, just steady. The kind of steadiness you only get when you know something nobody else does. They still laughed. They still whispered. Jason still strutted through the house like he owned it, tossing out barbs the way a boy tosses pebbles at a fence. Mark still retreated into his laptop shoulders, hunched as if hiding in numbers would save him. Linda still looked through me like I was a painting hung slightly crooked on the wall. But I had changed. When Jason rolled his eyes and called me old man, I didn't flinch. I didn't smile to make peace. I simply looked at him, calm, measured, and went back to my coffee. He smirked at first, but the silence unsettled him. Cruelty needs reaction. Without it, the joke collapses. At breakfast one morning, Linda fussed about the mail. "Strange," she said, shuffling envelopes. "Statements don't seem to be arriving anymore." I buttered my toast and said nothing. Mark frowned, flipping through the pile. "Maybe the post office is slow," he muttered. But his eyes flicked toward me, searching for something. He found only my steady gaze unblinking. They didn't know about the P.O. box. They didn't know the alerts went directly to me and to Thomas Green's office. They didn't know every account was ringed with locks they couldn't touch. That silence, that knowledge, was my leverage. I walked through the house with a kind of calm they mistook for passivity. But it wasn't surrender anymore. It was armor. Every step I took was measured. Every chore I did, oiling the hinges, trimming the hedges, stacking firewood, was proof. Proof that I was competent, steady, deliberate. Not confused, not fading, not gone. Mrs. Carter, the neighbor, waved when I raked the yard. "Ed, you're keeping this place neater than most folks half your age," she said. Her words carried more weight than she realized. Witnesses matter. Every nod, every acknowledgement from outside these walls was a quiet counter to the whispers inside. That night I wrote in my journal, "Competence is my testimony." Every clean hinge, every trimmed hedge, every stacked log says I am present. Jason noticed the difference, though. He didn't understand it. He tried harder. Louder jokes. Crueler digs. One evening he mimicked me in front of a friend, hunching his shoulders, clutching an imaginary cane, pretending to gasp for breath. His friend laughed nervously, but not fully. Something about Jason's act rang sour. I didn't rise to it. I simply watched, then turned away. That unsettled him more than any scolding could. Mark and Linda, too, began to sense a shift. My refusals were quiet but firm. When Mark asked if I could co-sign a temporary loan application, I shook my head. "Not today," I said, same as before. He blinked, caught between anger and confusion, then dropped the subject. When Linda asked me to tidy up before her book club, I answered evenly, "I already have plans." She pursed her lips, unaccustomed to boundaries. It was small, maybe even invisible to them at first. But to me, it was everything. I wasn't begging for their approval anymore. I wasn't filling silence with apologies. My quiet had shifted into something weightier, an unspoken declaration that I was no longer theirs to manage. That evening I stood by the lake, the same one where Jason had shoved me under. The surface was calm, the reflection of the moon rippling with the breeze. I thought of that night, his laughter, my struggle for breath. Then I thought of the locks now guarding every dollar, the witnesses quietly noting my competence, the journal filling with proof. I whispered into the cool air, "You didn't drown me. You forged me." Back inside, I opened my journal and wrote, "Their noise is wind. My silence is stone. Wind passes. Stone remains." And for the first time in years, I felt taller sitting alone than I ever had surrounded by them. The contrast struck me most in the quiet moments. Inside these walls, I was a punchline. Outside, I was still a man. On Tuesday, I was out by the mailbox when Mrs. Carter strolled over from her yard. She carried a basket of tomatoes, red and heavy, from her garden. "Too many for me," she said, pressing them into my hands. "Thought you might like a few." I thanked her, and she lingered, asking how I was holding up. Her eyes were kind, sharp enough to notice things without prying. I told her about fixing the shed roof last week, how the ladder had wobbled until I braced it with bricks. She smiled. Still handy as ever. That small acknowledgement carried more weight than Linda's polished compliments at her book club or Mark's distracted thanks when I paid a bill years ago. Mrs. Carter saw me. She didn't see a burden or a fund or an inconvenience. She saw a neighbor. Later, I ran into Mr. Alvarez from 3 houses down. He was loading mulch into his truck and called out, "Ed heard your mower's still running like a champ." "Starts on the first pull," I replied. Wish mine did he laughed. "You'll have to teach me your trick." Witnesses. That's what they were. People outside this house who still knew me for what I was capable, steady present. Not confused, not fading. Inside it was different. That same evening, Linda hosted her book club. I overheard her in the living room, her voice floating with that careful laugh she practiced like a piano scale. "Ed keeps busy," she told her friends. "He tinkers, he writes, keeps him out of trouble. Keeps me out of trouble." That's how she framed it. Not that I was keeping this house in order, or that I'd quietly carried them for years. Just an old man fiddling in the margins of life, harmless if kept distracted. I sat in my room with the door ajar, listening. I wrote in my journal neighbor's witness competence. Family dismisses it. Both records matter. One absolves, the other condemns. The next morning, Mark asked if I could move some boxes from the garage. "Too heavy for Linda," he said, not meeting my eyes. I looked at him evenly. "I already stacked them last week." He blinked, then mumbled, "Oh." He hadn't noticed. He hadn't cared enough to look. Jason, too, had his moments. He bragged to a friend on the phone about how easy it'll be once Grandpa's gone. But when Mrs. Carter greeted him on the sidewalk the next day, I noticed he straightened up, offered a polite, "Hello, ma'am," respect where he thought it mattered, disrespect where he thought no one was watching. That's when I realized the outside world was my ledger. Every witness, every kind word, every nod from a neighbor was evidence. And evidence, real human testimony, was stronger than gossip at a dinner table. That evening I wrote again, "When the storm comes, I will not argue. I will not shout. I will answer with witnesses and proof." I set the pen down and looked out at the lake. Its surface was dark, but not empty. Reflections of porch lights shimmered across it, small and steady. I thought of Margaret again. She had always said truth doesn't need a trumpet. It just needs to last longer than the lie. In the silence of my room, with the journal open and the smell of tomatoes ripening on the counter, I realized I finally understood. My silence wasn't just stone now. It was record. And record is what endures. The first cracks appeared around money. They always do. Mark came into the kitchen one morning with a stack of envelopes, his face tight. "Dad," he said, "did you change the account settings? The automatic drafts aren't going through." I stirred sugar into my coffee and took my time before answering. I adjusted some things. Adjusted. His voice had that edge of irritation that comes when a man's control slips. "What do you mean, adjusted?" "I mean the accounts are secured now," I said evenly. "Nothing moves without my say." He blinked, unsteady. "You could have told me." "I just did." He opened his mouth again, then shut it. He wasn't used to that kind of finality from me. Later that week, Linda tried her hand. She cornered me by the refrigerator. Her smile polished, her tone dipped in honey. "Edu, I noticed some of the credit cards don't seem to be active anymore. It's been inconvenient." I closed the fridge door, slowly looked her square in the eye, and said, Convenience isn't the same as necessity. Her smile faltered just a touch. She recovered quickly, of course she always does, but the flicker was there. Jason was the loudest about it. One evening he slammed his phone down on the table, muttering curses. "The tuition stuff's all locked up. What the hell, Grandpa Dad said it'd be easy." I set down my fork, wiped my mouth, and replied calmly, "Easy isn't always right." His face flushed, his jaw clenched, but he didn't push further. He wasn't ready for a fight without an audience. Dinner that night carried a strange silence. Usually Jason filled it with jokes, Linda with chatter, Mark with distracted hums of agreement. But this time they glanced at me as if waiting for a slip, a stutter, a sign of weakness. I gave them nothing. I chewed, swallowed, sipped my water, and let the silence stretch. Finally, Mark cleared his throat. "Dad, maybe we should all just sit down and—" "No," I said, firm, but quiet. "No more meetings where you talk over me. The accounts are mine. The house is mine. The decisions are mine. If you have questions, you'll get answers in writing." It was the calmest mutiny in history. My voice didn't rise. My hand didn't shake. But the air at that table grew heavier than any argument we'd ever had. Jason muttered something under his breath. Linda shifted in her chair, lips pressed thin. Mark stared at his plate, lost. I finished my meal, folded my napkin neatly, and stood. "Thank you for dinner." Then I walked to my room without looking back. Later, in the quiet glow of my lamp, I wrote in my journal, "Tonight they heard silence speak louder than words. Tonight they learned I no longer play the fool at their table." I closed the book, placed the pen across its cover, and felt steady. Because the truth had shifted. For years I had been their shadow background, overlooked, dismissed. Now I was the stone in their shoe. Small, silent, but impossible to ignore. I didn't go looking for him. I went looking for a milkshake. The burger place by the high school still smells like hot oil and onions the way it has for 20 years. I stood in line behind a kid in a band hoodie and checked the chalkboard specials. It was early evening, gold light slanting across the booths, the friars hissing their steady song. I had my hat on the old Navy one Margaret bought me in Savannah and a $10 bill folded twice in my palm. Jason's voice found me before I found him. He was in the corner booth with 3 boys and a girl I didn't know, backs pressed to red vinyl paper baskets heaped with fries. He didn't see me. He had an audience. He had the kind of grin people mistake for charm. He was telling a story with his hands broad theatrical sweeps, and the kids were leaning in, hungry for the show. And then the old man flails like he's auditioning for a lifeguard video, he said, pitching his voice high and ragged. Laughter. He slapped the table, then lurched sideways on the bench, one hand to his throat, gasping in mock panic. "No, no, help!" He squeaked the falsetto, slicing through the friar noise. The girl laughed into her straw. One of the boys thumped the table, wheezing. I stood very still, as if stillness might make me invisible. The kid in front of me ordered extra pickles. I kept my face turned to the menu board. My ears had already chosen their station. Jason kept going. He described my hands scrabbling at the dock, the cough, the way I dragged myself up like a drowned cat. He grinned, eyes bright, and said, "I swear the guy looked like a soggy scarecrow. Even the gulls were like, 'Bro, you good?'" Another round of laughter. He held his hands a few inches apart. This close to giving him a Viking funeral. I didn't look at him. I ordered a chocolate shake and a small fries. The cashier told me a number. I carried the receipt to the far end of the counter and watched the stainless steel spinner blur cream into cold silk. My heart didn't pound the way it did that night. It moved steadily like a man walking uphill, work not panic. Jason wasn't done. He mimed the shove with a lazy palm wrist, loose a neat little flourish at the end, as if cruelty were elegance. The kids roared again. Then one thin, quiet, dark hair falling into his eyes didn't laugh. He stared into his basket and nudged a fry around like he was drawing a map in salt. My number was called. I took my tray and sat at a table near the window where the late sun turned the parking lot into hammered brass. I sipped the shake. It was too sweet. I ate 3 fries I couldn't taste. I kept my back to them and made myself small in a way that registered as neutral to anyone who happened to look. When I left, I dropped my trash in the bin and pushed the door open with my shoulder. The bell on the frame made that same tired chime it's made since the Clinton years. The air outside felt cleaner. I stood in the sun and let it sit on my face the way a hand sits on the back of a tired neck. "Mr. Cole," a voice said softly. I turned. The quiet boy from the booth had followed me out. He stood there, hands tucked into his sweatshirt sleeves, eyes skimming anywhere but my face before he made them land. "I'm Noah," he said. "Noah Park." I'm in 2 classes with Jason." He swallowed. "That was messed up. In there." The words didn't come with performance. They came like a debt being paid. I nodded once. "Thank you for saying so, Noah." He darted a look back at the window. Jason was still inside, head thrown back, mouth wide, the show continuing without the cost counted. "He does that," Noah said. "Plays it for laughs. People laugh. It's easy." He shifted toe, scuffing the curb. "Look, I don't want to cause drama, okay, but I filmed it. I filmed what he just did. And I filmed before." He flushed. "The night he pushed you. I was on the dock path with my bike. I heard shouting and then he stopped. I didn't know what to do. I froze. But I pulled my phone out. I still have it. Something moved in my chest. Relief, anger, grief, gratitude, 4 horses pulling in different directions and somehow making one motion. I steadied my voice. "You still have it," I repeated. He nodded hard. "I didn't post it. I don't want to blow up anyone's life or whatever. But it's wrong what he's doing. And if you need it, I wanted you to know." I took out a folded card with my P.O. box on it, and the number Thomas had told me to use. I don't give that number out lightly. I pressed it into Noah's sleeve-hid hand. "Text me a link," I said. "Or bring a copy to this box. If anyone asks you, handed an old man a coupon for a free donut." A quick grin flashed, the kind that belongs to boys not yet trained out of decency. "Yes, sir." He tucked the card away. "And, I'm sorry. About what happened. People, they go along to get along." He glanced at the window again. "I shouldn't have laughed last week. I did. I felt sick after. I'm sorry." "Apology accepted," I said. "Spend it on doing better. That's how apologies pay interest." He nodded, relief loosening his shoulders. "You talk like my grandpa," he said, half smiling. "He fixes radios in his garage. He says things the same way." "Then he's a wise man," I said. Noah bobbed his head, then hustled back inside the bell, giving its tired chime again as the door swallowed him. I stood in the sun for 1 more minute and watched a girl push her little brother in the cart past the corner of the lot. Mundane, steady life kept happening, uninterested in Jason's show. At home, there was a voicemail from Marion at Thomas's office. Calm, crisp. "Mr. Cole just confirming Friday at 10 for the capacity evaluation. Dr. Huchu, minimal paperwork. Bring your ID and any current medications list. We'll see you then." She gave the address, the suite number, the side entrance instructions. The click at the end sounded like a well-fitted clasp. I wrote the details on a sticky note and pressed it to my desk. Fry 10-0 Dr. Shu. Underneath, in smaller print, "Bring list, bring ledger, breathe." My phone buzzed. Unknown number. A text. Noah Park. Sir, here's a private link. Don't share it with anyone you don't trust. You can download. I'm sorry again. I tapped. The video opened on the dock path, tilted shaky, a boy's breath in the mic, then the frame pulling sharp as it found the lake. A splash. The sound of laughter, not from joy, but from the bright edge of a knife. My own hands, useless starfish, slapping at water. A voice that is mine and not mine, strangled and small. Jason's silhouette, tall, casual over the rail. A chorus of dude and bro. A clear, unmistakable shove before the splash, as if someone had underlined a sentence with a bar of steel. I watched it once. I watched it twice. The second time I took notes the way I used to take measurements, timestamps, angles, who stands where, who laughs when. Then I downloaded the file, moved it to a little black thumb drive I keep in the desk, and labeled it with the date. I put the drive in a small tin where I keep Margaret's ring and the extra keys, steel on steel. I forwarded the link to Thomas with 5 lines. Source student witness name available if needed. Content shove. No aid rendered. Public mockery later. Action requested file as record. Advise on preservation. Capacity eval. Friday 10, Anzulmoro confirmed. I am steady. I didn't get a response right away. I didn't need one. Night doesn't make the compass less true. At dinner, Jason was all performance again, quick and bright and hollow. You see the game, he asked no one, and everyone narrating plays I hadn't watched. Linda placed grilled chicken on plates like we were guests at a show she'd produced. Mark read an email and said, to the wrong question. I ate slow and neat. The quiet around me felt no longer like exile. It felt like a wall built to code. After dishes, I walked the path to the lake. The air came off the water with that iron tang it gets midweek when boats have had time to sleep. I stood where the boards turn gray and looked down into the seam where water meets wood. Nothing in that seam keeps a record. People do. Back in my room, I opened the journal to a clean page. The pen moved steady. Today, a boy without power brought me proof. Not everyone is blind, not everyone is for sale. Noise performs. Evidence endures. I capped the pen and placed it beside the book. On the desk, the sticky note glowed faintly in the lamplight. FRI 10-0 Dr. Shu. I set my pillbox for the morning keys in their order wallet, squared to the edge. These are the small rituals of a man who will not be described as confused by people who cannot find their own shoes. Before I turned out the light, I let the day flicker once more across the inside of my eyes, Jason hands painting a lie for laughs, Noah hands tucked into sleeves telling the truth anyway. Then I slept, not the sleep of a man who has outrun the storm, but the sleep of a man who has checked every latch before the wind hits the door. Friday came crisp and cool, the kind of morning that makes the air taste cleaner than it is. I put on my navy blazer, the one Margaret always said made me look like I was about to testify before Congress, and pressed the collar flat. In the kitchen, I set my pillbox on the counter, lid snapped shut, rows neat, and tucked a typed list of my medications into my breast pocket. Mark glanced up from his laptop. What's with the get-up appointment, I said. Nothing more. He shrugged and went back to typing. Linda didn't even look up from her phone. Jason was still asleep. The clinic was in a small office park, beige brick, nothing impressive. Marion met me at the side entrance with her clipboard. She smiled that professional, warm but efficient smile. Morning, Mr. Cole. Right this way. Inside, Dr. Shu's office smelled faintly of eucalyptus. He was younger than I expected, 40s maybe, with wire-rim glasses and a calm that felt genuine. He didn't rush. He didn't treat me like a case. He offered water, asked about the drive, then began. I'll be running you through a standard evaluation, he said. It isn't a test of memory alone. It's about judgment, comprehension, and decision-making. Take your time. No tricks. I nodded. I've been judged by tougher audiences. He smiled faintly and began. Questions about the date, the day, the year. Easy. Then about the president, the governor, the last major event in the news. I answered without hesitation. Math problems in my head, serial sevens backward from 100. I took my time. Steady wrote them on the pad when he offered it. He asked me to interpret a proverb. Don't count your chickens before they hatch. I said, it means don't spend money you haven't earned. Don't assume a future that isn't guaranteed. Like my grandson assuming he already owns a fund that still has my name on it. Dr. Shu looked up, pen pausing, then nodded. Clear. Concrete. Insightful. Next came a drawing, copying intersecting pentagons, then writing a sentence of my choice. I wrote in my careful block letters, silence is not absence. Silence is preparation. When it was done, he set his pen down. Mr. Cole, you demonstrate full decisional capacity. I'll provide a signed statement to Mr. Green's office today. Do you want a copy? Yes, I said. One for my file, one for a friend. He nodded. We'll arrange that. I stood, shook his hand. His grip was firm, respectful. Thank you, Doctor. On the way out, Marion pressed an envelope into my hand. Your copy, she said. Keep it safe. At home, the house was its usual hum. Jason sprawled on the couch, laughing at his phone. Linda on the phone with someone, her voice sharp with that performative cheer. Mark muttering over spreadsheets. I carried the envelope to my room and laid it on my desk beside the journal. I broke the seal, unfolded the letter, and read the clean black print. Mr. Edward Cole demonstrates decisional capacity. No evidence of impairment. He is fully capable of managing his financial and personal affairs. Signed, dated, sealed. I slipped it into a clear sleeve, labeled it in my neat block letters capacity letter, OCT 12. Then I placed it in the tin beside Margaret's ring, the thumb drive, and the deeds. My private vault. That night at dinner, Jason tried again. He launched into another story for Linda and Mark, this one about me misplacing my keys, turning it into a slapstick routine. They chuckled dutifully. I let him finish, then placed my fork down, folded my napkin, and spoke quietly. You can laugh as loud as you want. Paper doesn't laugh back. Jason blinked, confused. Linda frowned. Mark cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. I stood, carried my plate to the sink, washed it clean, and dried it before setting it in the rack. In my room, under the warm glow of the lamp, I opened the journal and wrote, Noise fades. Records remain. Today I built another wall. Let them come with gossip. I have ink signatures, witnesses. I set the pen down, placed the capacity letter neatly atop the folder, and exhaled. For the first time in years, I felt untouchable. I sat at my desk long after the house went to bed, the capacity letter still in front of me. The paper was simple, just a page of clean sentences, a doctor's signature, a date. But it felt heavier than the oak under my elbows. For years, Linda had sprinkled that little phrase into conversations like, Salt Ed gets confused sometimes. At barbecues at church, even at the grocery store when I paused too long at the shelf. A small dismissive laugh, and people nodded along. I had let it slide, thinking it wasn't worth the fight. But each time it chipped a little deeper into the way others saw me, and into the way Jason saw me. This letter was my shield against that kind of erosion. If they ever tried to twist silence into incapacity, if they ever whispered to a judge that I wasn't fit to hold my own pen, I had proof. Not memories, not arguments, not raised voices. Proof. I slid the letter into its sleeve and tucked it back into the tin. Margaret's ring glinted faintly beside it, her band of gold reflecting lamplight like a steady reminder. I whispered to her photo on the dresser. They won't erase me, love. Not while I still hold the pen. The next morning, the air in the house had shifted. Maybe it was only me who noticed, but I felt it. I poured my coffee, sat at the table, and studied the three of them. Mark hunched over his laptop shoulders, tight worry lines etched deeper each week. Linda scrolled her phone, lips pursed, as if she were rehearsing the next polished line she'd feed to her friends. Jason leaned back in his chair, tapping at his screen, grinning at whatever joke only he found funny. They looked at me occasionally, searching for weakness, waiting for the old man who laughed at his own expense. Instead, they found quiet steel. Jason tried first. "Hey, Grandpa, lose your keys again." His smirk expected a laugh track. I sipped my coffee, set it down carefully, and replied, "Everything I need is exactly where it belongs." His smirk faltered just for a second. He covered it with a chuckle, but I saw it. Later that day, I went through the house deliberately, checked the locks, tightened the loose screws on the pantry hinge, stacked firewood by the back door. Small tasks, but each one was a record of competence. Every neat row, every repaired hinge was silent testimony. If ever the whispers grew louder, if ever someone claimed I was slipping, there would be witnesses, neighbors who saw me rake leaves, doctors who signed letters, clerks who processed forms. That evening, I opened my journal and wrote, "Documentation is not cold. It is dignity preserved. Every signature, every note, every witness is a voice louder than gossip." When Jason clattered down the stairs later, announcing to his friend on speakerphone that he wasn't worried about college money, "It's handled." I didn't interrupt. I let him talk. I let him boast. Because I knew something he didn't. The account was sealed, the locks in place, the record airtight. His words were wind. My documents were stone. I watched him walk out the door, shoulders cocky laugh echoing down the driveway, and I felt nothing but clarity. I didn't need to shout to the world who I was. I didn't need to beg for respect from people who mistook love for weakness. I had built my fortress in ink and silence. That night, under the hum of the lamp, I copied a line into my journal twice in the neat block letters of an engineer who still trusted precision. Noise is temporary. Records are forever. Then I closed the book, lined up my keys, set the pen across the cover, and slept soundly, because I finally understood that I had already won the only battle that mattered. The weekend stretched long and slow, the kind of days where sunlight pools on the floorboards, and you can hear every tick of the clock on the wall. I sat at the kitchen table watching the dust motes swirl in the air, and thought about what each of them really saw when they looked at me. To Mark, I was money. Not memories, not a father who carried him through lean years, but a resource. Something to lean on when numbers didn't add up. His shoulders sagged under the weight of his own choices, and instead of facing them, he leaned into me year after year. To Linda, I was liability. An accessory to manage to tidy up before company came to keep out of trouble, so her polished life didn't snag on the edges of mine. She didn't want me gone, not exactly. She wanted me contained, silent, a backdrop to her performance. And Jason saw me as an obstacle, the last barrier between him and what he thought was already his. To him, I was a vault, waiting to be emptied, a stumbling old man who didn't realize the world had passed him by. They looked at me and saw weight, cost, inconvenience. But outside these walls, I was still something else. When Mrs. Carter handed me a jar of her peach jam across the fence, she said, "Ed, no one ties knots like you. My clothesline's never sagged since you fixed it." That wasn't liability. That was trust. When Mr. Alvarez waved from his truck mulch, spilling from the bed, he shouted, "You still the sharpest guy on the block, Ed? Wish I had your eye for detail." That wasn't cost. That was respect. Even Noah, that quiet boy from the burger shop, had seen me, not as an old man drowning, but as a person worth defending. He had risked speaking truth when everyone else laughed. That wasn't inconvenience, that was recognition. I carried those small dignities with me like coins in a pocket, clinking softly to remind me I still held value. That night I sat at my desk, opened the journal and wrote, "Family sees burden. Neighbors see competence. A boy sees injustice." Truth is not lost. It just shifts where it is found. I thought of Margaret again, her laugh ringing through summer kitchens, her hand steady on mine when I doubted myself. She would have told me not to measure worth by those who choose blindness. She would have said, "Ed, kindness given freely is never wasted, even if it isn't returned by the ones you hoped." I whispered into the quiet, "You were right, love." The lake shimmered outside the window, moonlight rippling across its surface. I remembered the cold grip of it pulling me under Jason's laughter echoing above. But I also remembered my own vow rising stronger. I don't sink. I endure. Endurance wasn't just surviving their contempt. It was noticing the moments of dignity that still lived in the corners of my days. The jam jar on the counter, the clothesline holding firm, the nod of a neighbor, the proof in my documents, the ink in my journal. I wasn't money, I wasn't liability, I wasn't an obstacle. I was a man, and I still held the pen. I heard the word on a Tuesday the way people try on a shoe in a store, turning the ankle to see how it looks in the mirror. Placement, Linda said in the kitchen, voice low but not low enough as she scrolled her phone. "There's a wait list, but if we get his name in now..." Mark murmured something I couldn't catch. I didn't step closer. I didn't need the details yet. I needed the shape. They had moved from jokes to logistics. That's when contempt ripens, when it learns calendar math. I rinsed my coffee cup, set it to dry in the rack, and wrote on the notepad I keep in my breast pocket, Tues 9:42 a.m. Placement, wait list. I didn't write their names. Ink remembers what mouths later deny. All day the word hung in the house like a draft you can't quite locate. Linda on the phone with someone named Diane. Her tone dipped in syrup. "Of course we just want what's safest." Mark at the table with a brochure, open to a photo of a man my age holding a therapy dog. Jason breezing through, tossing off, "Free up some space finally," as if he were discussing a closet. I didn't argue. I wiped the counter, checked the back door lock I'd oiled last week, and wrote another line brochure on table, "Independent living," circled. "Memory care," underlined. A question mark carries more weight than a scoff if you file it properly. That evening they tried to make a meeting of it. Linda arranged her hands on the table as though prayer might make it polite. "Ed," she began soft and rehearsed, "we've been thinking about..." "I know," I said. I heard the word you're trying not to say too loudly. Silence landed ungainly. Mark cleared his throat. "Dad, we want to be responsible. For everyone." "Good," I said. "Responsibility is best handled in writing." Jason smiled into his water glass, the way a boy smiles at a dare someone else has to take. "Here's how this will go." I continued calm as measuring a board twice. "If you have a proposal, you'll deliver it to me in writing. I'll read it. If I have questions, I'll ask them also in writing. If you need to speak to anyone about my affairs, you'll route it through my attorney." I slid Thomas Green's card across the table. "That's his name." Linda's smile pinched at the corners. "Isn't that a bit formal? We're family. Formality is what people use when they want facts to outlast feelings," I said. "You're welcome to your feelings. I'm choosing facts." Jason snorted. Mark studied the card like it contained a trick. "Dad, no one is attacking you. You pushed me toward the word placement," I said, not raising my voice. "That's not a hug." I carried my plate to the sink, washed it clean, dried it, set it in the rack. Ritual is steadiness made visible. On my way out of the kitchen, I said, "If you need my availability for a tour, submit dates." My calendar fills. In my room, I opened the journal and wrote, "They have moved to logistics." Good. Logistics leaves footprints. I made a second list beneath it, neat as a blueprint. If they schedule a tour without me, decline in writing. If they raise confusion capacity, letter on deck. If they escalate forward to Thomas, no hallway debates. Witnesses, neighbors, Dr. Shu bank clerks, receipts in order. The next morning, a trifold brochure appeared on my dresser, as if I were a prospect. A smiling couple in matching sweaters drank coffee on a veranda, under the words, "Live your best years." Someone Linda, I guessed, had circled a line in pen restaurant-style dining. Weekly housekeeping. In the margin, she'd written, "So easy for you." Easy is a word people use when the cost is paid by someone else. I paperclipped the brochure to a blank page in the journal and wrote the date. Then I spent an hour doing what memory care caricatures don't, balancing my checkbook to the penny, reconciling two small statements, taping the receipts in tidy rows, writing OK in the margin when numbers kissed. I left the ledger open on my desk, no flourish, just truth, sitting where eyes could land if they wanted. At noon, I walked 2 blocks to the post office and picked up a form for forwarding important mail should I ever choose to move. And only if I chose. I filled in nothing. Choice is a muscle. You keep it toned by reminding it it's there. On the way back, Mrs. Carter called from her porch, "Ed, that clothes line is still a champ." I smiled. "It's the knot." She laughed. "Always the knot." Witnesses, little anchors in public air. A text buzzed when I reached my gate. From Marion, Mr. Cole, Dr. Shu's letter is filed. Mr. Green suggests we finalize your letter of intent this week. Would you like to dictate or handwrite? I replied, "Handwrite." My voice. She answered with the time, Thursday, 2nd the 30. Private room, ready. That evening, Mark tried a softer angle. He found me on the back steps, watching the lake put on its evening steel. He sat beside me like a man approaching a skittish dog. "Dad, it isn't about getting rid of you," he said. "It's about, support." "I have support," I said. "I built it." He rubbed his palms together. "You know, Mom. Your mother believed in boundaries?" I said. "She wore them like a belt. That's why her dresses hung right." He smiled despite himself, then looked down ashamed of the smile. "Look," he said, "the place Linda found has a shuttle, activities, a nurse on call. If something happened..." "Something did," I said. I drowned within earshot of people who could have helped. The nurse I needed then was decency. It didn't clock in. He swallowed, then nodded a small muscle working near his jaw. "Okay," he said softly. "Okay," Mark, I added. "If you're scared for me, be brave enough to say scared instead of responsible." "They aren't the same." He nodded again. "I'm scared," he admitted, voice low. "About money, about everything." The word hung there honest for once. I let it be. "Put it in writing," I said gently. "We'll handle what's real." The next day, Linda announced in the kitchen like a cruise director, "Great news, Diane can fit us in for a tour Friday at 2. It'll be fun to look around." She said fun the way a realtor says cozy about a closet with a window. "No," I said. "I have an appointment." She blinked. "With who, my attorney," I said, and let the sentence sit. She exhaled through her nose. "So adversarial." "No," I said. "So adult." She busied herself with the fruit bowl as if the bananas needed choreography. "I just want what's best. What's best," I said, "will be substantiated." In the afternoon, I drove to Thomas's office and sat in the small, private room Marion had promised. A lined pad waited. I dated the top right corner, underlined it, and began the letter of intent in my own hand, each line a beam to whom my quiet has confused. My home is my choice, my money is my tool, my body is my responsibility until the law says otherwise and we are not there. If you use the word placement without my consent, you use it against me. If you love me, you will speak to me. If you plan around me, you plan without me. I paused, listened to the pen settle on the paper, then continued. I have documented my capacity, secured my accounts, and recorded events. Should any party misrepresent my condition to gain control, this letter is to be read aloud in a neutral room with my counsel present. Afterwards, the no contest clause will govern. I signed it full name, clean, with the steadiness Dr. Chu had already notarized in his way. When I handed it through the glass to Marion, she read the first and last lines, met my eyes, and said softly, "Clear." On my way home, I stopped by the credit union and put a fresh copy in the safe deposit box. Paper doesn't take sides, it takes shape. That night, Jason performed the future again. When we move Grandpa, he said to a friend on speaker, I'm turning the den into a studio. Finally, some space. He laughed like a man who thinks a wall moves because he points at it. I wrote one line before bed. Let him measure the room he thinks he's already in. Let his own tape come up short. Then I laid out my pillbox, lined up my keys, squared my wallet to the desk edge, and set the capacity letter's sleeve where the lamplight could glance off the seal, not as a threat, as punctuation. My silence wasn't the blank between words anymore. It was the grammar. Outside, the lake whispered against the pilings. Once it had tried to take my breath. Now it sounded like a metronome. I matched it, inhale to exhale, and slept the measured sleep of a man who has finally understood that quiet isn't retreat. It's governance. The house carried on as if nothing had shifted. Linda still filled the air with her polished sentences. Mark still bent over his laptop like a man hoping numbers could cover silence. And Jason still strutted through the rooms, his laughter sharp as broken glass. But beneath their noise, my silence had settled into something undeniable. I walked through each day with the certainty of a man who has built walls too solid to be kicked in. The documents were filed, the locks in place, the witnesses recorded. They could mutter placement all they wanted. They could joke about tuition funds and den conversions. None of it could move one brick of what I had secured. On Wednesday evening, Jason tried again. He was sprawled on the couch with his friend replaying the lake story, waving his arms for effect. I stood in the doorway and listened for a moment, calm, as a man studying weather he already knew would pass. When he noticed me, he grinned. "Hey, Grandpa, want me to show you how close you were to becoming fish food?" His friend shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting to me. I simply looked at Jason and said evenly, "You'll find water deeper than that one day. Make sure you can swim." The grin faltered. The friend coughed into his hand. I walked away without waiting for a reply. That night I opened the journal and wrote, "A joke is a balloon. A record is a stone. Balloons float. Stones remain." The days grew quieter in a different way. They began to sense the change, though none of them would admit it. Linda's smiles grew tighter. Mark's questions about money trailed off into silence. Jason's barbs landed with less laughter, more uncertainty. My silence pressed harder than any shout could. I found small comforts outside these walls. Mrs. Carter's peach jam on toast. Mr. Alvarez waving from his truck. Noah's text short, respectful. "Hope you're doing okay, sir." Each was proof that not everyone was blind, not everyone was cruel, and each reminded me that dignity can live in the smallest corners, even when stripped away at home. On Friday, Thomas called. His voice was calm, steady. "Mr. Cole, everything is filed. You're shielded on all fronts. The locks are yours alone." I thanked him. After the call, I sat at my desk for a long time, Margaret's photo propped against the lamp, her smile catching the glow. I whispered, We built something strong, love. They can't take it? Not anymore. Then I opened the journal to its final page and wrote the conclusion I had carried in my chest since that night on the dock. Family may forget your worth. They may laugh. They may plot. They may circle the word placement like vultures circling a field. But worth is not theirs to give or take. Worth is proven in what endures. In neighbors who remember your hands fixing their lines. In boys who whisper truth when laughter grows cruel. In papers signed in ink that doesn't tremble in silence, that holds steady when noise tries to break it. If you are watching this story unfold, learn this silence is not surrender. Silence is strategy. Do not hand your dignity away for the sake of peace. Protect it, record it, live it. Because one day when others try to write you out of your own life, the record you've kept will speak louder than any of their voices. I set the pen across the page, closed the book, and placed it neatly on the desk. For the first time since the lake, I felt not just steady, but free. And if you've walked with me through this story, if you've felt the weight of silence and the sting of betrayal, I ask you now, share your thoughts below. Tell me where you found your strength when others tried to strip it away. And if you believe dignity is worth protecting no matter the cost, then subscribe. Because these aren't just my stories, they're ours. Together we keep them alive. Together we endure.